exactly. Right away. Good job. So Landon was saying the war hawks, right? So when you think about birds, like types of birds, a hawk is a bird of prey, right? Understand that? So during Vietnam, you had people who absolutely kind of supported the war. Okay. And so this was a pretty common language of the debate about Vietnam was if you supported the war, i.e., if you were a hawk, then who would be your political sort of team? And then if you were opposed to the war for a variety of reasons, what is the universal symbol of peace? A dove. So a dove is a person who is not in support of the war. Now, there are a variety of politicians during this period who were hawks and doves. Goldwater was a hawk. Nixon was a hawk. But LBJ was a hawk, honestly. I mean, if you consider what we're talking about here. Now, normally the Republicans in history get the term hawkish more often, more warish. But, it's not a definitive. It's not like the Democrats wake up that we're not going to fight. But hawks and doves are the two symbols of the war, and really all wars. Now, later on, we're going to talk about in the war in Iraq, you will see a term get used, the first war, the second war in Iraq, called chicken hawk. And there were certainly chicken hawks during Vietnam. Several of our presidents have been these guys. So what this is people who talked tough about the war, but didn't go fight in it. You understand? So you had our last president, President Trump, had bone spurs, so he got a bunch of deferments. President Clinton was a Rhodes Scholar in Oxford during the war. President W. Bush, he flew in the Air National Guard of Texas, defending us on that border. So none of those presidents served in Vietnam. They found ways to avoid it. That was one of the reasons why this war was so unpopular, is that so many people found a way to avoid it. Vice President Cheney had, I don't know, like 4 or 5 deferments because he worked for a business during the time. It was an important war business. So if you were rich, you knew somebody, or if you were politically connected, you would not serve in the war. But boy, there was a disproportionate number of black folks, a disproportionate number of brown folks, and a disproportionate number of white rural folks in this war, meaning it was a poor man's war big time. So when we get to this anti-war movement, probably the song that is most consistently remembered about that in the war is a song called Fortunate Son by Creedence Clearwater Revival, where they sing about, I ain't no senator's son, I ain't no fortunate one. I'm the one who's got to go fight. Bob Dylan will write a song called The Masters of War. The ones making the war aren't the ones who have to go fight in the war. And that's very much a consistent criticism of the war in Vietnam, is that it's a rich man's war and a poor man's fight. And particularly if you were a black person, because they were like, life's already bad enough here. I got to go die in Vietnam too. So yeah, I would be familiar with hawks and doves for sure. Somebody asked me yesterday, what did the South Vietnamese do to help their own liberation? And the answer is not much. In other words, they just were not that supportive of the war that was supposed to be for their liberation. There were some, and I don't want to discount the brave guys that fought in Arvin that helped and did what they were supposed to do. But a lot of times the government of South Vietnam was totally feckless and corrupt. So that was part of the problem. And I told my sons last night, we were talking about this, and I said, imagine if it was the American Revolution, right? And the French did all the fighting, and that's kind of what the Vietnam War had become. It was their war and we were doing all the fighting. And that doesn't make any sense at all to me, and I say the same thing about Afghanistan. So nonetheless, definitely be aware of that. And it's after, after this starts to heat up, after these they call these Zippo raids, where Zippo was a gas lighter, a cigarette lighter. And they would go and the huts of the villages in Vietnam were made out of fronds of thatch, like they were grass material. And so they were highly flammable. And our guys would literally go in and just burn down the whole village, or they would relocate it to a hamlet or something like that. And this is really where the war begins to turn an ugly face, is we literally couldn't figure out who the good guys and the bad guys were, because it's not like the Viet Cong wore a uniform by day. You didn't know who these people were. They could have been the guy you talked to that morning and he was setting up a bomb for you or sniping you that evening. So let's move then into why the war really becomes unsuccessful. Okay, and I told you there were lots of different protesters. There were veterans who returned from the war, and they said the war was wrong. Most notably is our former Secretary of State and the U.S. Senator John Kerry. He came back as an officer and said that we were behaving like Genghis Khan, like destroying people. And this was a very common phrase, common quote. Hell no, we won't go was used by the Students for the Democratic Society, particularly this chant. So if you went to a war protest, this would be a common one. 69 at Woodstock, you have probably one of the most famous songs of the period. It's called the Fixin' to Die Rag, which is a song. And it starts off, and it's 1, 2, 3, what are we fighting for? Don't ask me, I don't give a damn. Next stop is Vietnam. And so it was like a chant. And they would sing this over and over again, Country Joe and these protesters. So I mentioned that the war was led by this man through most of the war. He will ultimately be replaced by another general named Creighton Abrams, but you don't have to know that now. So Westy says, in 67, we see a light at the end of the tunnel, and then the light slams shut. This is one of the worst events of the entire war. And it's somewhat ironic because we win. So the Vietnamese are Buddhists by and large, and they have a Buddhist calendar holiday, which is kind of like their 4th of July, like a national, and their New Year celebration. It's like a big holiday, and it's called Tet. It's the Tet holiday. And every year during Tet, there would be a ceasefire, kind of like a Christmas ceasefire, right? So we would stop for the holiday, and usually there would be some skirmishes, and some people wouldn't honor it. But, in 68, the military announced that, there would be a Tet ceasefire, right? And we expected there might be an attack somewhere, but, that was normal. What we did not expect was over 100 cities and bases and the U.S. Embassy all being attacked simultaneously. This is the largest offensive of the entire Vietnam War, and it comes all throughout Southeast Asia. So if you look here, this is South Vietnam, right? Every one of those dots are major attacks, not minor attacks, major. There were lots and lots of minor ones too. But Hue City, where this H-U-E is pronounced Hue, like Hue, it looks like, Hue City was taken by the Viet Cong. Saigon, our embassy fell. This is a picture right here on the left of our embassy. The MPs, the CIA, you would actually have video footage of the CIA and the MPs shooting into our embassy, trying to kill the Viet Cong, right? So, this was an unbelievable attack all across Vietnam. Our air bases, our military troop bases, and we beat every one of them. We beat them all. We pushed back. And some of them were danger close, like overrunning Ton Son Nut, for example, Air Force Base, and others. But we repelled it. We knocked them back. So then why is this the worst thing that could happen? Well, guys, if you look at this, the media covered it, right? This was a televised war. And I'm not going to blame the media for losing Vietnam, but they certainly didn't help. The news covered this, and the narrative was, if there is a light at the end of the tunnel, then how can they possibly stage a coordinated attack over 100 cities, over 20 big cities? How can they take over cities like Hue? In other words, that doesn't sound like people that are losing. That sounds like people who are more than willing to keep fighting, right? 5 years into our presence in Vietnam, and they're attacking us. They're not on the defense. They're actually launching a major attack. And yes, we beat them back. But Americans saw this and they're like, what are we doing here? Why are we still here? Because a lot of Americans get killed. All right. We wiped out their offensive, but nonetheless, it seemed like this was not a light at the end of the tunnel at all. In fact, it looked like we were now on the defensive. And if we're on the defensive, then we're not winning. So I definitely know the Tet Offensive. Here you can see pictures. This is the battle in Hue City. This is an old imperial French city that was absolutely destroyed. If you watch the film Full Metal Jacket, one of my favorite movies, it's about the Vietnam War. The second half of the film takes place in Hue City along the Perfume River. And this is Saigon, the capital of Vietnam, South Vietnam. And there was open explosions in the street. The war had not been around the city itself. It had been around the Iron Triangle nearby, but not in the city. So this was a really just devastating event. Here you can see all the red dots. So what was the impact of this? Well, Americans were stunned. They were stunned because we're the big guy, right? We don't get attacked like this. And we couldn't believe it. And we really didn't trust Lyndon Johnson, because he had been telling us how the war was close to being over, and there was going to be victory soon, and this didn't seem like that at all, particularly the way it was labeled. Now, I have this picture, and it's actually the background of the PowerPoint slides. This is Lyndon Johnson crying. This is him openly crying in the Oval Office or in the White House. He had a room in I think it may have been in the Roosevelt room, but I'm not sure. I forget where. But they would meet with these generals, and every time, I mean, Johnson would literally sign the letters that would go to people who were killed. Now, and early on in the war, they didn't have this prepared. And you talking about being unprepared. The guys that got killed in the first battle, the Battle of Ia Drang, their parents were notified of their death, or their spouses, by telegram. So like a telegram operator came up to their house, Western Union, and it said, we regret to inform you, the Defense Department regrets. I mean, they got a telegram. Wasn't even a preacher or anything there to help console them. So Johnson later would write personally letters to the families of these Americans who were killed. And he would cry, and it upset him. He hated it. A tenderhearted guy. But, he could hear within the Oval Office chants from outside the White House, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today? Right? And they would chant that over and over again, these protesters. And it broke him. It just broke him. And later that evening in January, Walter Cronkite, who was the most respected news broadcaster in America, he had been the CBS guy for a long time and would remain that way for a while. And he's going to give an editorial. He's going to read it, and you can go watch it online. And he'll say that he considers the Vietnam War, from our perspective, unwinnable. And when he does that, LBJ says, if I've lost Cronkite, I've lost the American people. Like, we are not supporting the war anymore. Now, to be fair, that's not totally true. It's not like Americans just stopped supporting the war outright, but it made a huge shift in who supported the war and who didn't from before. There were a whole lot more Americans now who began to oppose the war outright, or at very least not want us to continue it personally. Here you can see that there were, this is a satire titled Vietnam, filmed in real blood and guts color. And so lots of rhetoric against LBJ, like heatedly against LBJ. LBJ's popularity dropped to 36%. That's really low. You understand that under 40% is never good for any governing president. Really under 50% is probably pretty bad. So in that vacuum emerged an election year. You understand? And there became a vocal critic within the Democratic Party leadership who spoke out against the war in Vietnam. He was the leader of the Doves, and his name is Eugene McCarthy. So from now on, if you're writing about the Cold War, you need to make a distinction between Joe McCarthy, who was the senator who led McCarthyism, and Eugene McCarthy, who was vote clean with Gene, right, or get clean for Gene. Now, clean for Gene was kind of neat because McCarthy's supporters were kind of like the hippies, right? But they realized that looking like a hippie will not get you any support in America. And so they literally shaved their beards, cut their hair short. They got clean with Gene. And then they would go house to house campaigning for Eugene McCarthy in the primary against LBJ, against the president. So you had a Dove running in the primary. He finished second in the New Hampshire primary. It's the first primary of the year. By about 6 points, I think, 6 or 8 points. But that was really close to the sitting president. So LBJ is now facing an opposition candidate within his own party. Senator McCarthy was a genuine pacifist. He opposed the war. He thought the war was bad, and he ran on that. And he was a decent guy. And so this posed a threat to President Johnson. And then even more nightmarish for Johnson, New York Senator Bobby Kennedy started running for president. Robert Kennedy, and he was absolutely adored by the Democrats. Like they were going crazy. Bobby Kennedy is to the left of JFK, right? He's even more liberal than John Kennedy.
Room service.
Hey,
Sorry about that.
that's all right. Thank you.
Thank you.
So Bobby Kennedy was, hey, cool, thank you. I need that right now. Bobby Kennedy was a pacifist, and he was an active civil rights advocate. So he was a big-time civil rights leader, right? He's the guy who actually put civil rights in the Justice Department and pushed for it. And so if you can see that picture at the bottom, he would ride around in an open-top limousine. You'd think he'd have learned from that, right? I shouldn't say that. And he would be propped up. People would like not worshipfully, but it kind of reminds me of how the crowds were around Trump. They just like poured on him and propped him up there, right? So Bobby Kennedy and Eugene McCarthy are both running as doves. Okay, Robert Kennedy. Yeah, he's totally able to run. He became president in 63. He got elected in 64, so he's only been president for 5 years. So that's cool. The limit on the 22nd Amendment is 10 years. So he's eligible to run. That's a good point, all right? But he then stuns the nation. Keep in mind, LBJ was like uber politician, right? He comes on national television. He says there will be a freeze of escalation. In other words, we're going to stop sending more troops. We're going to reduce bombing. And he says, I cannot, in good conscience, I have to devote all of my energies to the Vietnam War. I shall not seek and I will not accept the nomination of my party. So President Johnson, who could be running for re-election, chooses not to. And so that's the biggest result of the Tet Offensive. Everybody understands that. That was a huge, just a bombshell announcement. You can watch that speech online too. But Johnson comes on and says, I will not seek or accept the party nomination. So that means whoever by the way, when he announces that, his vice president's name is Hubert Humphrey. And Humphrey will now become Johnson's sort of successor as the candidate for the mainstream, if you want to call it that, or the hawkish Democrats. So Humphrey will now run instead of Johnson, but so will McCarthy and Kennedy. So you're going to have a three-way race for the Democratic nomination. Okay. Now, I told you that American morale in 68 starts to slip, and that's because several things start to become known. One of those is that the draft really was unfair, right? As more important people are getting drafted, it's like I said, more and more black folks, brown folks, poor white folks, and that is unpopular. The draft had multiple. Now you didn't pay $300 for a replacement, but like I said, if you were in college, if you were an important businessman, you didn't have to get drafted. You just avoided the draft altogether, and so that was unpopular. While the military was desegregated, there was intense racism within the ranks of the military. It was just what happened, and particularly between white officers and black soldiers. There was also a heavy drug use going on within the military itself. So to know something about Southeast Asia, heroin comes from Southeast Asia. So there was heroin use, heavy marijuana use, and these guys could get it easily in Saigon particularly. And so there's a lot of drug use going on. Then one of the things that really made the soldiers, you had a year deployment. So you would be sent to Vietnam for 12 months, like literally 365 days, and they would count down. So once you got to within 20 days, you'd be like short, like you were a short timer. You were ready to go home. Don't send me in the field. I don't get shot at. Officers only served 6 months in combat, and the other 6 months was in the rear with the gear. Infantrymen, all 12 months in combat. So what you start to see is something called fragging. So if your officer was brave or courageous and wanted to lead you into a battle and charge ahead, the soldiers were like, we just trying to get through this, man. We're not trying to get killed. And so they would literally pull a grenade and throw it in the officer's quarters and blow him up and be like, oh, it's enemy fire. So you understand? Or they'd shoot him in the back in combat. They'd kill that officer. So that becomes known as fragging, F-R-A-G-G-I-N-G. So this is a war that was really turning ugly, in multiple ways. So back here, it looked like Bobby Kennedy was going to get the nomination. He won the California primary. The night he won the California primary, he gives a speech. Okay, he's in the Ambassador Hotel in LA. As he's leaving his speech, going through the kitchen of the Ambassador Hotel, out to where his Secret Service is and stuff, a young man named Sirhan comes up and shoots him in the chest. All right, and he shoots him because the Kennedys were pro-Israel, and he was an angry Arab, and he shot Kennedy because of his support of the state of Israel. This is a picture of Kennedy bleeding out here. Here he is dead or dying on the cover of this international paper. So, this absolutely crushed the support, the people who were doves. This was their guy. Bobby Kennedy was going to be able to be like John Kennedy plus, and now he's dead. And this was just an absolutely devastating blow. It was heartfelt. Obviously, it's terrible for the Kennedy family. It's just 2 brothers now killed. Well, 3 if you include the eldest brother died in World War II. You know, so now 3 of the brothers are dead. And the 4th brother is going to become a U.S. Senator, Ted Kennedy, but he is going to make a terrible mistake. He is going to drive drunk away from a party out at a they live in Massachusetts and near the the kind of richy part of the Massachusetts coastline, right? And there's a place called Chappaquiddick, which is like a spot by the beach. Ted Kennedy is driving back from that across this really narrow bridge. He drives off the bridge. He's got a young woman with him in the car. He gets out of the car. She doesn't, and she dies. So he kills basically by accident a woman, and he'll be a U.S. Senator well into my lifetime, well into the 90s, but he'll never have a chance to be president after that. So this family is often considered cursed in a way, like blessed and cursed. Like they had these wonderful leaders who also had terrible flaws and terrible tragedies. So nonetheless, Bobby Kennedy is killed, and that was a real sad day. The war is now creating an even heavier protest. Like, in other words, starting in about 65, you start to see a lot of protests, but not too much. By 68, you're seeing these things like weekly, and they're particularly on college campuses. They start primarily at University of California at Berkeley. I showed you earlier Columbia University. And one of the groups I'm going to show you in a minute, called the Students for a Democratic Society, are going to help coordinate a massive protest of the Democratic National Convention. They're going to try to, keep in mind the convention, they were hoping it would be Bobby Kennedy. After the primaries go through, Gene McCarthy doesn't get enough votes. It's going to be Hubert Humphrey. He's going to be the nominee. He has made it clear that he is not going to immediately withdraw troops from Vietnam. And so they have a pro-war Democratic Party, and that is very troublesome to them. So the SDS and other groups will all converge on Chicago in the summer of 68. And Chicago was run by a political machine, a mayor named Richard Daley, the Daley machine, they called it. And Daley was not going to let his city be overrun by the radical left or the hippies. He wasn't going to let that happen. So he gets every cop in Chicago, basically, and they're guys in these blue helmets, to descend on the convention. And they surround the convention center, and they call it Fort Daley. All right, and it's got barbed wire around it and armed soldiers, and it literally looks like a military compound. And that evening, the group of protesters, one of them, are protesting in a park beside the convention center, and the police come in and order them to leave. An altercation starts, and the next thing you know, cops and protesters are in a full-scale melee or a battle on TV, like national TV. People tuning in to see the convention, and here cops are like just beating just wailing on these people, and there's blood everywhere and mayhem, and this is a terrible moment. If you're watching at home, you're like, what on? This is a national convention of a political party. It's descended into Haymarket, right? It's madness. And so this was a big moment in the anti-war movement. Afterwards, you saw the emergence of sort of almost celebrity status, because Chicago will bring the Attorney General and the federal government will bring criminal charges on what are called the Chicago 7, right? So if you ever want to look up the counter-revolutionary leaders of the 60s, look up the group Chicago 7. You'll see here the most famous of the Chicago 7, or infamous, depending on who. His name is Abbie Hoffman. So if you've ever seen Forrest Gump, the movie, do you remember there's a guy wearing an American flag shirt and he's like screaming into the thing? Yeah, that's Abbie Hoffman. And yeah, he was a protester. He was part of the counterculture and a major leader of it. And he wrote a book, and the title of the book is "Steal This Book." It has no price. Like literally, he's encouraging you to steal it. So it's called "Steal This Book." He was by far the most sort of famous of the Chicago 7. Like people knew who Abbie Hoffman was. This guy was the actual organizer of it, and his name is Tom Hayden. You can see him up here. He was the leader of the students, one of the leaders of the SDS at that time. Hayden will go on and marry a famous actress, an actor's daughter named Jane Fonda, and she'll become one of the most sort of infamous anti-war protesters of the war in Vietnam. She was famous. That's her winning an Oscar right there. And that's Tom Hayden, her husband. Hayden will, they'll ultimately be found. They had a judge who absolutely wanted them convicted. Like he couldn't stand them. But in the end, they're going to get, they're not going to, you can't blame all the riots in Chicago on these 7 people. Jane Fonda is one of those protesters who I personally can't stand. And the reason is she is going to, with her money, and be able to go to Vietnam, North Vietnam. She's going to tour the Hanoi Hilton, the quote Hilton. It's the prisoner of war compound. And some Americans are going to try to slip her like secret messages to bring back to America. And she gives them to the jailers, So, she to me it's one thing to oppose a war. It's another thing to aid the enemy. So, a lot of Americans consider her kind of a traitor for doing that. And she's called Hanoi Jane, because of that action. But that's her husband, Tom Hayden, who's one of the Chicago 7. Okay. So all that protest means in the end, now we're going to go over Nixon a whole lot tomorrow. Okay. But Nixon is going to make a reappearance. And I don't give you a lot on him now, but I'll tell you a little bit about Nixon. So Nixon loses in 1960, remember, to Kennedy by like a hair's breadth. But when he loses, he goes on. The reporters are asking him, Vice President Nixon, how do you feel and stuff? And he looks right at the reporters, and he's like, "Well, you won't have Dick Nixon to kick around anymore." That's kind of like his attitude. Is like, "You guys are the reason I lost, and now I'm going to shuffle off somewhere." So he seemed kind of ugly and irritable. Well, when he comes back in 68, that kind of attitude has been pushed away. He's not that Nixon anymore. He's now sort of an elder statesman in the Republican Party. He's very tough on the war. He has a secret plan to win the war in Vietnam. So that the hawks in America like that. He's a social moderate, though, on democratic policies, right? So he's a Rockefeller Republican on domestic issues. But he's kind of like a hawk plus a Democrat, so it's an interesting thing. And he is going to win very, very comfortably. Take a look at that. 301 electoral votes to Humphrey's 191, right? LBJ's state vote for Humphrey because I guess, they missed him. Because that's a great question. So Landon asks, how's a hawk able to win? Well, first of all, he says we're going to win. And most Americans, that's what we want to hear. We don't want to hear we're going to quit and go home. That's what McCarthy was saying. That's why he didn't get the nomination ultimately. The anti-war movement is a very, very vocal minority. You understand? Now, the public opinion has shifted against the war. Don't get me wrong. Ted did that. But, Nixon has said, I have a way to win the war. And people are like, okay, well, that sounds better than we're going to quit and go home, right? But that's a good point. Now, to go back to the other thing is that Humphrey is going to be completely associated with LBJ, like at the hip kind of thing. And LBJ is very unpopular at that moment, like hugely unpopular. It also helps Nixon that Wallace, and you remember George Wallace, Governor Wallace, he's going to pick up 5 states, So by winning these 5 states, these are maybe states that would have gone Democratic, right? I mean, they're the Deep South, okay? And by winning these states, he runs and Wallace is one of the few third-party candidates ever in American history to win electoral votes. He's very successful down south. So that tells you that his brand of populism, which is the angry, rabidly racist kind of discussion, is still very much a real thing in America. That didn't go away just because he didn't win last time. So Wallace is going to win the Deep South. And Nixon is going to obviously continue the breaking into the solid South that you saw back in 64 in states like Virginia, Carolina, South Carolina, and Florida. So be aware of that. But Nixon is going to run on a very restrained, thoughtful. He's not the attack dog of 52. Remember that when he ran as vice president? He's not like that anymore. He's much more of a elder statesman, literally. And so he seems like a much better candidate for the right. Now, for the left, the idea of continuing the war doesn't sound great, but Humphrey says that too. So you asked about how does a hawk win the election? Well, your choice was between a hawk and a hawk. So it wasn't really, Wallace was going to nuke them, or bomb them heavily. So it was really 3 hawks, so there was no dove candidate in 68 on the national level. And that's another reason why he won. So yeah, Nixon takes over. So let's look at this group, this very loud, vocal minority opposition. So if you ask your grandparents, unless they grew up in the 60s and went to a major university in the 60s, they probably weren't a part of this, because this was for, honestly, more well-to-do upper middle class kids. If you went to Woodstock, a lot of those kids were rich. They don't look it, in the videos, but you got to have money to be able to get to upstate New York. Like, you just get there. So who or what forms the counterculture? So first of all, you should know kind of like the component. So when I call it the counterculture, I don't call it that. When I use that label, the counterculture is pretty much the kind of broad umbrella for a group of people that emerge on the left of the political spectrum, who absolutely don't trust the government anymore. So they have a genuine negative attitude towards authority. Okay. So they're distrustful not only of government, but they stop going to church. As a people, they're not churchgoers. They distrust all forms of authority, really. These are the people who are going to take over their college campuses and sit-ins. They're going to attack ROTC buildings. They're going to attack the president's offices of college campuses. When I say attack, I don't mean like shoot people. I mean like occupy them or tear up, vandalize them. So they're overwhelmingly young. Okay. And they are really, really disillusioned with two things in particular: the slow pace of civil rights progress and the war in Vietnam. These are the two things that they're most angry about, the civil rights and the war in Vietnam. And you would see so when we hear the word hippies, the counterculture included a variety of people. The people up here in this picture are the electric Kool-Aid acid test. So you guys know Tom Wolfe's book, or Timothy Leary. Here's Timothy Leary. So you had a group of people who were full-blown hippies. And by that, I mean they left society. The phrase was tune in, turn on, and drop out. So turn on means to go beyond your secular tribal mind to contact the many levels of divine energy which lie within your consciousness. So very Eastern, kind of like a Buddhist thing. Like you're going to transcend, right? You're going to get turned on to the spiritual existence, right? Tune in means to express and communicate your revelations in an act of glorification, gratitude, and beauty. So tie-dye shirts, right? Or paintings that are really fascinating to look at, or album covers. Oh my God, if you look at the album covers from the 60s, they're impressive. And then drop out. And drop out means to leave mainstream society. So here you have the Merry Pranksters and this bus, that's like graffiti tie-dye. So these are the young kids, usually in their 20s or teens, who are doing acid, LSD. So they're taking hallucinogenic drugs, smoking a lot of pot, right? Listening to acid rock, or bands like the Grateful Dead, Jefferson Airplane, Jimi Hendrix. So a lot of that kind of music, right? And they're living in communes. So what communes are, right? So they're going to go live in the countryside, and these are going to be the guys that coordinate Woodstock, the music festival of peace and love in '69. And so that's a key part of the counterculture, the hippies. So the hippies are peace, love. Oh, by the way, they practice lots of free love, which means, being actively sexual with multiple partners. And I want to really emphasize to you guys, most people in America were not like this at all. Like, this is kind of like talking about the flappers of the 20s. They're like a very small but very hip group that got a lot of attention, So they grew out of this group. So I wanted to remind you, these guys were the cool guys before the hippies were. These are the 50s sort of avant-garde, creative expressionist people. And so don't forget the Beat generation, who the idea of these young people, and keep in mind, who are these young people? These are the baby boom, right? These are the kids that were born in the 50s, and so they've grown up with all that materialism of the 50s, all that conformity of the 50s, and they didn't like it. They said, this sucks. Because if all that does is produce Vietnam and racism, well, I want to go live in a farm somewhere and, grow tofu or soybeans. I guess you grow tofu, but grow soybeans and, have sex with a lot of people and not shave my armpits. That was kind of like what went on a lot. And they had a reason for doing this. They weren't just like, hey, let's go be smelly and do drugs. But it was to drop out from, mainstream society, be a counterculture. Make sense? So this is Timothy Leary. Leary was the first to actually experiment with LSD. LSD was developed by the U.S. military to try to make a truth serum, and back in the 50s, like upscale cool people in their middle ages in New York would take acid at parties for for fun, like, hey, let's take this blotter and see what happens. But by the 60s, he popularized it. Timothy Leary did. And so you had a lot of kids using LSD, acid. And that was a major component. So I told you it was young people. And really, it has to do with that. There's so many of them. The young people of the 60s is the baby boom. So, my mom went to college at James Madison, but no major upset there. Tech had a campus closure from protests on campus. But by and large, Virginia kind of avoided it. It was really at the sort of most liberal schools in America, like Berkeley. Berkeley would become the sort of headquarters of, at very least, the student counterculture. So at Berkeley, you had this guy right here. His name is Mario Savio. And Berkeley had, at the time, Berkeley is a part of the University of California system, but it's fairly exclusive. It's in a nice neighborhood and, kind of rich kids. But at Berkeley, they had a fairly conservative policy of not allowing any political advocacy on campus. So you couldn't like chant for a politician or hold marches or, very different from today. But back then they were trying to, keep things calm. And so this young man that you see here is Mario Savio. That's his name. He was the leader of the free speech movement. And they did what we would call a sit-in. They occupied the campus. So that means they went into the halls of administration and the students sat in their rooms. They occupied that part of the building. So when they did that, the police came and arrested hundreds of them. But the university, Berkeley, was so embarrassed by how they had treated their students, they reversed the policy. So once students in other schools saw that this worked, that they got to protest and march and rally on campus as a result of the sit-in, it spread like wildfire. So all across America on college campuses, you would have the free speech movement, okay? But it did start at, or in the University of California at Berkeley. So be familiar with that, okay? So I have a question here. I said, what type of behavior marks the counterculture movement? I kind of put that out of sequence, but, lots of drug use, all right? Lots of radical publications. So that they would have these small publications, these pamphlets passed around. Usually it was on college campuses. Lots of cool movies made about this era in history, by the way. There's Easy Rider. If you've never seen Easy Rider, that's one of the great ones. Dennis Hopper and Jack Nicholson, Peter Fonda. So nonetheless, these are the kind of people of the counterculture, hippies, hipsters of their day, if you will. And at the same time, we had a sexual revolution going on in America. Now, part of that sexual revolution was a result of, I should probably switch order here, was a result of this. So, we know that people have been using contraception. I'm glad nobody knows what this is. Look at it. You guys are like, what is that? So the thing on the upper left is the birth control pill. All right. If you didn't know it, maybe you did. But the birth control pill is, taken for obvious reasons to prevent pregnancy. And, what you're looking at is like a wheel where each day of the month, and so every day of the month, the lady would take the pill. And what that did is there had been contraception before the 1960s, obviously. The condom is like thousands of years old, apparently, at least 1,000 years old. But what this did is it fully liberated women from unwanted pregnancy if they were on the pill. It's like 99% effective. So you saw a huge growth in women taking birth control. And with that, that kind of took some of the pressure off of having sexual relations, understanding that. Here you can see up here, this is Planned Parenthood. And you can see women marching for abortion. So that's a major shift in by the way, this is a period in feminist history called second wave feminism, where you have the kind of Betty Friedan kicked it off. And now one of the domains for women's rights is women's rights to their body, right? And so this was before Roe v. Wade, and most states in America did not have legalized abortion, right? So you have both the use of the pill and the demand for safe and legal abortions. And then you also had for the first time, really, I think, in American history, and I've read a little bit about it, you have homosexuals becoming politically active and out. So before this, and really it starts in the late 50s. You may remember the Kinsey study. Kinsey, the guy who like discovered that a lot of people who were gay actually were gay. Before that, most, and heck, even after this for a long time, most people who are homosexual were in what we call the closet. So being in the closet means not publicly for behaving, I guess, their identity, not behaving sexually, where people would know it. And so you had your first group that you need to know out of California, out of San Francisco. So San Francisco had been a destination for homosexuals since the 1940s. So what that, like, in other words, people moved there because it was a safe community. And you had a thing created called the Mattachine Society. So Mattachine, which is Mattachine, the Mattachine Society was a group that tried to publicly coordinate with other homosexual groups around the country to try to, advocate for rights. Keep in mind, at the time, there were lots and lots of laws against homosexual behavior. No such thing as gay marriage. It was a crime to engage in homosexual activity. So lots of crimes against it. And then the event that really brought this to the forefront of a lot of people's mind, in New York, down in Greenwich Village, there is a hotel, I guess you would use that word, called the Stonewall Inn. And the Stonewall Inn was known to have frequented gay guests who would go there, hook up, so to speak, and then, not stay long or whatever. And a group of off-duty cops knew about it, and they came and they started beating them up. They beat up the people at the Stonewall, and the Stonewall people rioted. They rebelled against that, and you have what was called the Stonewall Rebellion or the Stonewall Riot. And then they protested and marched in the streets of New York. But I don't want you to think that for gay rights that there goes like this huge progress after that. The guys, gay people and homosexual people will not have much in terms of equal treatment under the law until the 90s, and so from 70 to the 80s, you're going to have in the 80s emerge the AIDS epidemic, which is going to stigmatize homosexuals even further, right? And so really it's been since, I guess, the 90s. I think back to when Bill Clinton was president, one of the first things he did in office, there had been a controversy about whether or not gay people could serve in the military or not. And so Clinton changed the official policy. The official policy was no. If you were gay in the military, you were dishonorably discharged if they knew it. And so Clinton changed the policy to don't ask, don't tell, meaning we don't want to know if you're gay, and we're not going to ask you if you're gay, right? And that's what it was until President Obama, who lifted the ban on gay troops in the military. And so it's been really since the 90s you sort of see a kind of growth in gay rights. But gay rights were, clearly part of the sexual revolution. Yeah, that was still against the military's policy. If you told, you would be discharged. Yeah, absolutely. But I always say that progress comes in small steps. There's no way Clinton could have desegregated, if you will, the military, like legalized gays in the military, and not gotten enormous. I mean, he got a lot of blowback just for what he did. So if he'd gone even further, I think there would have been rioting practically, because a lot of people really hated Clinton already. So that made it even worse for his support. But for moderates, that was seen to be a reasonable policy. So anyway, know that. And then this is where the counterculture started to go off the rails. So the Students for a Democratic Society were I think, a legitimate protest group. They protested at Chicago. They helped organize it. But by the 70s, this group that had really been about, and you can see up here, end racism, end U.S. wars, stop police crime, stop repression, women's liberation, education rights, a free university is a free society. So think of this as a very large student protest group demanding, marching, doing what you would expect, right? But by the time Nixon gets elected, it becomes pretty clear to a lot of the SDS kids that this isn't going to work. Like, we're not winning, like Nixon won. So the group that remain turn into terrorists. And this is one of the really most dangerous moments in the counterculture. So the remainder of the SDS that leave it become known as the Weathermen. All right, the Weathermen or the Weather Underground. You'll sometimes see it referred to that way. The Weathermen or the Weather Underground. Here's an FBI wanted poster of members of the Weather Underground. These are buildings that they sent mail bombs to, or they bombed. Now, the weathermen are going to kind of die out because they made the terrible decision to make nitroglycerin in the same place where they were smoking cigarettes. And so they're going to blow up. At least that's what we've been told. Now, some people think the FBI blew up, but nonetheless, the leaders of the weathermen are going to blow up in an apartment in New York, and that'll be kind of the end of them by the early 70s. But, one of these guys' names got thrown around when Obama was running for president because President Obama knew a former weatherman somewhere in his career in Chicago, and he's got to be a part of the Weather Underground. Like, no. But anyway, do know the weatherman, and it should tell you that by this point, the counterculture has kind of consumed its own. Like by the early 70s, the protest movement has died out. So not yet. In 1970, there's going to be a major protest in 70 and 71. By 73, people aren't rich enough to be protesters anymore. I'll put it that way. You're going to start to see a change in the American economy, and we end the war in Vietnam. So this kind of peters out by 71, 72. Okay. So definitely be aware of that. And so what created the environment where these folks had so much, ability to do? I mean, if you look back at the 60s, it's kind of amazing to see all the like, how do they do that? Like, who's got time to do that? So there's three things that kind of explain who the counterculture were. Well, first of all, there was so many kids. It's bound to be at least a bunch of them because it's the baby boom, right? So a big population of them, population bulge. Secondly, the counterculture had as a sort of unifying theme protest. But if they weren't protesting, I don't know if there had been a counterculture. Like, why would they all get together? Oh, let's all get together and do drugs. No, it probably wouldn't happen that way, So, and then thirdly, these were pretty much well-to-do teenager kids. So they weren't people who had to go work in the factory or work in the mine. They were like, hey, I'm 19 and I got summers off. What am I going to do? Oh, I'll go volunteer for the McCarthy campaign. I'll go to Woodstock. So these are kind of, I guess a product of the 50s in a way. Like they are the young people who are the outgrowth of that. I do want to emphasize, though, this is not the adults of that period. By adults, I mean like, the grown-ups in their late 20s, 30s, and 40s. This is the youth movement. And there were young conservatives, don't get me wrong, but they didn't get as much press because they weren't marching and blowing stuff up. Okay? So that's not the end of my notes, but that's the end of the 60s, because for whatever reason, they stick Nixon in here and the other chapter too. You may have noticed I uploaded a quiz for you to do by tomorrow. That is 36 and 37, right? So that's the LBJ and part of 36 and 37. So in other words, it's the 60s. By the time in the 70s, and you'll have had all of it by the time you look. I mean, we've had all of it by the time you take the quiz. But be familiar with this stuff. And I'm going to switch over now to the other sort of the kind of change in dynamic of this period, and that is the 70s or the late 60s and the early 70s. So, if you think about how the 60s started, we started the 60s with a Kennedy, right? And we ended it with a Nixon. So that alone tells you how much the optimism of the American people went away. Like just the whole 60s are like an arc of, hey, America's awesome, we're great, we hate ourselves. It's just like we fell off a cliff. And really, I think that we have not fully recovered from the 60s, honestly, today. Because if you look at that distrust of government, it's still as high as it was in the 60s. Because Nixon's not going to do us any favors. He's going to give us Watergate, right? So that made more disillusionment and unhappiness and distrust of the government. And then we had the culture wars, and they're going to come along and make us hate each other, right? And so we're really dealing with the ashes of that and trying to rebuild something new. I think we're in a new phase of American history it could be awesome or it could be ill, depending on how we handle it. So anyway, let's look at the 70s. So like I said, by the time Nixon becomes president, he's like this elder statesman guy. But I do want you to understand that Nixon, in many ways, is one of the most complicated presidents we've ever had. Robin Williams used to joke that if Shakespeare were around, we would have Richard IV. And it would be about this guy, right? Richard IV. So he had tons of inner demons. His brother died of tuberculosis in a terrible way in front of him. Like it was an awful wasting away disease. He went to a small college, and so he always felt inferior. He had what we would call an inferiority complex. He went to Whittier College, which is a small Quaker college in California. And of course, his great rivalry was with John Kennedy, who went to Harvard, right? And so Nixon always sort of felt, Kennedy looked youthful and handsome, And Nixon, pale and at 5 o'clock shadow. So he was also very, very paranoid. Nixon was a solitary kind of brooding guy. Now, it did make for really good contemplation. Like Nixon thought a lot. And I will tell you this, Nixon was very smart. Like he was a very smart guy. And he was particularly gifted at understanding foreign policy. In fact, he was brilliant at foreign policy. And so in many ways, Nixon could have been a very, very good president, but his paranoia, his low self-esteem, for whatever reason, I mean, he's the president of the United States. He doesn't need that low self-esteem, but he had some real problems, personal problems. He drank a lot as president. Now, there is debate about whether or not he was an alcoholic, but I don't know that that's fact. In other words, a lot of people drink a lot, so he was known to drink, though, and he certainly was vindictive. You guys know what vindictive is? He carried a grudge, right? So he reminds me in some respects of that part, like Donald Trump. Like Trump, he's got an enemies, and if you're his enemy, you're gonna suffer for it. Well, that was Nixon. Nixon kept an enemies list, literally, with people who'd done him wrong on it, and he planned on getting revenge, and he did, a lot of times. So he's an interesting, complicated guy. Now, I want you to write this down, and I don't really have it in the textbook as a question, but I think it's essential that you understand that there was a sea change that occurred at the start of the 70s. And so for 2 decades, so from basically Truman all the way through Nixon, America had its greatest prosperity ever, right, in all of our history. Our middle class had doubled and redoubled. Our standard of living had grown dramatically, and that began to come to an end in the 70s, okay? So here are the reasons why our economy began to decline. First of all, we had always had a competitive advantage after World War II. Why? Everyone else is in rubble, right? Yeah, so think about like Japan, they were a wasteland, right? Germany, they were flattened. So yeah, we had this huge competitive advantage for over a decade. But by the 70s, Japan is a fully modernized, industrialized society. Germany is fully healthy. Britain has recovered. France. So we're now competing on an equal footing, and we've kind of gotten lazy a little bit. American auto manufacturers have kind of gotten lazy, and so we got smacked in the face by Toyota and Honda. Like, where did this come from? Secondly, the war itself is going to consume an enormous amount of money and resources, as well as human lives. 58,000 Americans died. Okay, government regulations can and do stifle profit. The key is to find a happy medium, right? You don't want the regulations to be so burdensome that the government stifles companies from development. Well, by the 70s, that had happened. We had so many regulations that were burdens that companies were less productive. And we had our first major slump in productivity in 25 years. Workers they weren't making as much. They weren't being as successful. And I see that that's where we kind of are now. We had a huge productivity boom in the 90s, y'all. And I'm hoping we'll have a rebound in the 20s, right? We're not there yet. And then I mentioned already that these are now economic rivals were fully developed, Japan and Germany. So this is what Nixon, Ford, and Carter, and Reagan are going to have to deal with. They're going to come into an economy that's not roaring anymore, not booming anymore. We can certainly talk about, and we will talk about LBJ's policies as part of the problem too. The Great Society itself is not inherently inflationary alone, but if you combine it with the Vietnam War, this is probably the number one problem. So at the time of Nixon, the biggest economic problem facing our country is inflation. So you remember what inflation is, right? Dramatic rise in prices. Well, normally it's due to one of two things. What's it due to?
Increasing the money supply.
Too much money, increasing monetary supply. Good. Not producing enough to meet demand. Right. When you reduce production, well, this wasn't a production problem. This is too much money. So how is there too much money in circulation? Because the federal government was not only producing money to pay for the war in Vietnam and the Great Society, it was consuming resources, which thus made them more scarce, right? So the more that war production, instead of making cars, we're making helicopters for the war. Or, instead of people having a job, they're getting welfare benefits. So that's money for nothing, basically. You just here's some money. And so this is the kind of stuff that is really inflationary. And inflation, if you know anything about it, kills savings, right? Because your savings rate, usually the interest on savings do not increase at the rate of inflation. So inflation is an absolute killer for people with money. And we talked about this when we talked about the populists, right? Like the populists wanted this. Well, here it is. And it sucked. I remember it. All right. You know, you can buy a flat screen, massive 46-inch flat screen now, cheaper in real dollars than you could buy a 19-inch TV then. Right. So, you know, and it was like a picture tube and it was done. So it is a different period in history living in the 70s. It's the reason why they had to invent disco, you know, because it reflected how sucky the times were. So anyway, Nixon has campaigned that he is going to bring an end to the war in Vietnam by winning. Peace with honor. That's his slogan, right? We're going to have peace because we're going to win. Okay? Yeah, secret mission. Now, Nixon is the first to articulate kind of famously the phrase silent majority. Nixon, when he's campaigning, will talk about the great silent majority of Americans. And so he's talking about are the people who aren't in the counterculture, the people who aren't marching and protesting, the bums, he called them, right? So I will, you know, remind you that the vast majority of Americans were not in the counterculture. So that kind of makes sense, right? And this will be the beginning of a sound strategy that I think Republicans still utilize more, and that is to target white people, like literally. You know, like he's basically talking to middle America. You people in Iowa, you people in Indiana, you know, you don't want all this rioting and all these marches. And so that works, by the way. That's a very smart campaign strategy, silent majority. So what was his policy towards Vietnam? What did he intend to do? What was his strategy? His number one strategy was to get us out. All right. So right away, he announces Vietnamization. Vietnamization. And that means to turn, and by the way, he later calls that the Nixon Doctrine. We call it Vietnamization now too, but you know, the Nixon Doctrine is to let your allies do the fighting for themselves. You understand? Which sounds like commonsensical, except in South Vietnam, they weren't prepared to actually win that. Like they weren't going to win it. I think Nixon kind of knew that. He just wants to extricate America from it and then let them lose on their own terms. Does that make sense? Because by the way, by 73, containment's not really a thing that much anymore. You know, we are now 28 years into the Cold War. We're not as concerned about the spread of communism as we once were. I mean, yes, there's still the evil empire, quote unquote, but you know, we're more focused on other problems now. So he wants to get out of Vietnam. And that's called Vietnamization. But then he's going to do unbelievably bad decision, I think. And that is to start bombing Cambodia. So it was kind of a smart idea when you think about it. What's in Cambodia? Very good. The Ho Chi Minh Trail, right? So if we bomb the Ho Chi Minh Trail, it will disrupt, you know, the flow of goods and resources into South Vietnam, except it didn't. It didn't stop at all because the North Vietnamese could rebuild the Ho Chi Minh Trail in a matter of hours. These guys were like perfect at that, you know. They're like walking engineers when it came to their bridges and all that. So we're going to bomb Cambodia for 4 years. We're ultimately going to invade Cambodia in 1970. And this is going to totally disrupt that country. And I'll talk more about that later. Another thing we utilize, which will have tragic results, is we start trying to disrupt the Ho Chi Minh Trail as well as VC hiding places by dropping a toxic defoliant on it, a toxic herbicide. And so these planes would fly over the jungle, the canopy, and it would be these huge barrels, and it would come out in a liquid form, and it was Roundup, y'all. It was Roundup. That's y'all know Roundup. You know, you're supposed to have gloves and a mask, and when you handle Roundup, they're dumping it on the open forest of Vietnam, right? Our soldiers walking under this would have this defoliant drop on them. I've read, so actually, when I was a graduate student at Virginia Tech, I did some of my work at the Salem Veterans Administration Hospital. I wrote a major paper on Agent Orange syndrome, because what this thing does is it made our soldiers die of cancer. It made them have terrible lesions, right? It caused them to have organ failure over time because it's Roundup. You know, you're like pouring Roundup into people. It did turn a lot of the Vietnamese jungle into wasteland, right? Their children will be born, our soldiers' children will be born without eyes, missing fingers or hands. I mean, it's terrible. So Agent Orange was an attempt, to find the VC, but it led to this terrible development. So we'll pick up with Nixon and in Vietnam tomorrow, and I hope you guys have a great day. Okay, go ahead and take that quiz if you can.